and welcome to Women Speak, a production of the Women's Resource Center in Wayne. I'm your host, Mojdeh Keykhah, and each month I focus on a topic that is of interest to women and the people they care for. This interview is being conducted via Zoom during the coronavirus crisis 2021 on MLTV Mainline Network. Today, Women Speak is happy to have Joyce Platfoot, Executive Director of Radnor Memorial Library in Wayne. Joyce holds a master's in Library and Information Science from Drexel University and has worked in public libraries in this region for 14 years, including Ludington Library and the Haverford Township Free Library. She is active in the Pennsylvania Library Association and is currently chair of the Southeast chapter. The mission of the Radnor Memorial Library is to provide programs, collections, space, and other resources that enhance the quality of life for the entire community. Joyce, I am so excited and honored that you are joining Women Speak today and that we will be talking about trailblazing women as part of Women's History Month this March. Thank you for graciously offering to give us a curated selection of several books and materials about this topic, which are also available at Radnor Library.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mojdeh. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm so interested in getting into this topic. Let's jump right in and go with the first person you've selected for the Women History Month.
Absolutely. So the first women that I wanted to talk about were two local women, Rebecca and Ellen Windsor. Rebecca and Ellen are really interesting and somewhat eclectic Wayne residents that have left a lasting legacy at the library. They were born in the late 1870s and the early 1880s. Rebecca and Ellen were raised in the Tri-County area, so Delaware County, Chester County, Montgomery County. And according to Ellen, the family loved to talk and read, and their ideas developed in a really happy atmosphere. They attended the Galbraith School in Philadelphia, and they traveled around Europe as young women. In 1934, after Rebecca's husband died, this is where things start to get interesting, I think. They decided to live together in a series of comically named homes like the Monster or the White Elephant. And the last one that they lived in was less comically named, but still interesting, called the Spring House, and that was on Brook Road in Wayne. They were known to share a lot of causes, and they enjoyed shocking the neighbors. For the time when they lived, they were really quite unusual women. They considered themselves anarchists. They were not religious. They were strict vegetarians, and they enjoyed throwing parties with all sorts of characters. They had a deep interest in the arts and artists, and their greatest pleasure was music. So they lived their life in Wayne creatively and loudly. And in 1959, they both died within hours of each other, believe it or not. One was had an extended illness, and the other died just from shock.
Oh,
it's such a sad story. But they bequeathed their home, Spring House, to the township, to Radnor Township. Unfortunately, the township was not able to accept the gift, but a court decided that the proceeds of the sale of the house could be given to the library. And in their honor, a room was built in the 1960s called the Windsor Room. And Rebecca and Ellen really hoped that their home would be a place for friendship, love, and peace, which is completely in the spirit of the library. And so we try to keep that will kind of alive in the space still today. One of the things you might like to know is that if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the Windsor sisters, you can listen to a podcast about these wild and wonderful women on our blog called In Windsor. And we'll be sure to point out the URL before the end of the show.
that's fascinating. So you have the Windsor sisters who were Wayne residents, and then they have a room named after them at the library through a series of events. And you even have a podcast named after them. So their legacy lives on.
Yes, it does. It's very lasting. And if you're ever interested, you can come to the library. We do have photographs hanging of them in the Windsor room, along with this story on the wall.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
It's nice to know sometimes about how things get named and what are their historical significance.
yeah,
I was just wondering if you could point out the time frame that their lives were in
yeah.
full force.
Yeah, absolutely. Rebecca was born in 1887 and her sister was born in 1891 or 1881. I take that back. 1870s and the 1880s, late 1870s, late early 1880s. And they both died in 1959.
Oh, wow. So that was a time when a lot of things changed for women.
That's right. Yeah, they really lived through such a huge diversity of experience for women, from that period to the 50s.
Marvelous. And who do you have up next, Joyce?
Okay, great. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was this book. It's just newly out called The Doctor's Blackwell: How Two Pioneering Sisters Brought Medicine to Women and Women to Medicine. So we're going with the thread of the sisters. This book is about Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell. It's written by Janice P. Nomura. And in this book, she recounts the stories of Elizabeth and her sister Emily, who also became a doctor. The sisters, later in their life, founded the first hospital staffed entirely by women. It was called the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children. And by the end of their lives, Emily had become a brilliant practitioner and doctor, and Elizabeth had really become an outspoken advocate for public health, particularly on the correlation between poverty and health.
Wow.
Yeah, very fascinating women. This book is really interesting. It's Elizabeth and Emily come from a family of 9 siblings, and there was a lot of letter writing. And so this book and all of its historical research is based on first-person narratives through these letters. So that's a really interesting element of the book. Even though the sisters find success, their story is really filled with a lot of rejection. They became doctors in the mid 1800s. At that time, women were midwives and healers, but they were not considered suitable for formal training as a doctor. And also, medicine was still very young, very different from today. Bloodletting was still being practiced, and surgery was fairly primitive. It involved saws and large tools, basically.
Wow.
So they were real trailblazers, and Elizabeth especially, she really believed that she was destined for something beyond the ordinary scope of womanhood, beyond being a mother or a wife. She always believed she was meant for something more. And medicine was a way for her to exercise her intellect and contribute to a noble cause. One of the cool things, is that they came from this very large family. And I think one of the ways they were able to overcome some of the obstacles that they faced was that they had this large family and this extended network of friends. They traveled a lot around the United States, both for medical school and, in their professional pursuits. And they also traveled to Europe. And they both really sought out and accepted whatever opportunities presented themselves. So their life wasn't a straight line. It wasn't like they said, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to go here, and then I'll live here and be practicing. It just didn't work like that. But they weren't deterred from their ambitions.
That's interesting that they had such a background overseas. They came to the United States and they realized their fulfillment of their dreams, being somebody who is proficient in the sciences, but also helping people.
Yeah.
What do you think were some of the main characters' challenges or facets of their personality that we can take into today's time?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think um, Elizabeth was not really, she wasn't as warm, maybe, as her sister Emily. And I think that, over time that developed into her uh, being drawn more to the public health aspects of medicine. And Emily was a very warm person, and healing kind of, writ large came a little more easily to her. And so I think that's kind of a lesson for us today to, in some ways, to pay attention to some of the natural gifts we possess, and allow them to guide us in our professional pursuits.
That's great. And what do you have up next after that
All
fascinating
right.
story?
So the next book I'd like to highlight is called The Women with Silver Wings by Catherine Sharp Landeck. So this book is a really interesting book. It's the inspiring, subtitled The Inspiring True Story of the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II. So it's a sisterhood of sorts, moving forward in time to World War II. And, the basic premise of this is that after Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941, the U.S. Army Air Force put out the call for women pilots to aid the war effort. Industries across the country were doing the same. We know, Rosie the Riveter, so building ships and all sorts of other places, the gardening and growing food, etc. That was happening, and it also happened in flight. 1,100 women were selected to become a member of the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, and the short name for that is WASP. The WASPs helped train male pilots for service abroad, and they ferried bombers and supplies all across the country. So initially, the idea to bring trained pilots into the Army Air Force began with Nancy Love. She and her husband were both pilots, and they owned an aviation company called Intercity Aviation. Nancy understood pretty early on, before America was even involved in World War II, how women could help support the effort, assuming that male pilots would be on the front. She knew that women could really help ferry planes to the borders for their journey overseas, and also help with the supplies. And at the same time that she pitched her idea to the Army, another woman named Jacqueline Cochran, who was an accomplished air racer, she had been racing for a long time. She was very well known. She was sort of a celebrity, basically, in the 30s. She had gone to Great Britain with a team of American women pilots, and she was serving in the Air Transport Auxiliary. She was ferrying men to the front and aircrafts to the front. She had also this idea that women could play a part in U.S. war efforts, and she was really interested in training women. And so what ended up happening through the course of a lot of conversations was the bringing together of these two women, Nancy to kind of organize existing pilots, and Jackie to begin a training program for women. So like I said, 1,100 women were chosen and trained. Unfortunately, 38 did not survive, which is a very small number, but still a tragic number. One of the women who did not survive was from Wayne. Her name was Mary Holmes Howson, and she was killed during training in 1944. She actually has a banner along Route 30. You can see her picture, and her name is also forever etched on the memorial wall in the library.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's quite a connection.
Yeah. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
This book is really interesting. It brings out a lot of the stories of the individual women who played a part in the Corps. So, yeah. And also, if anyone is interested in learning a little bit about early women in aviation, the library is hosting a program on Bessie Coleman, who was the first African-American aviatrix. That program will be held on March 24th via Zoom. And Bessie learned to fly in France in 1915 at the age of 23 and went on to become an incredible flyer. So it should be a really interesting program.
And these are not the airplanes of today. These are differently constructed airplanes, the airplanes of the early 20th century. That is an amazing amount of courage. And I'm wondering, what do you think led women like Bessie and Mary from Wayne to want to learn how to fly?
You know, I think some of it was just a desire to make a contribution, a desire to play a part in the efforts, and also kind of a understanding that there shouldn't be anything that holds me back from doing whatever anybody else can do.
That's definitely an inspiring take on their aspirations. And I think also the technology of the time offered opportunities maybe that they didn't want to let go by.
That's right. Yeah, and I mean, in some ways, flight was still very young at that point. Although, planes had played a major role in World War I, it still was quite early in flight's history. So it was really, trailblazing in its own way.
Absolutely. So who's up next?
All right. So the next woman that I wanted to highlight, her name is Zaha Hadid. And this is actually a children's book about her. I wanted to be sure to highlight a children's book. This book is called Building Zaha, The Story of Architect Zaha Hadid by Victoria Tentler Krylov. And Zaha Hadid was a world-renowned architect. She was born in 1950 in Baghdad, Iraq. And her father was an educator, and they made a lot of trips to the Sumerian region of Iraq where there were a lot of rivers. It was a very fertile region. And one of the things that caught her attention in this region were the people who lived on boats. They had these beautiful rounded tops, and the boats were created of reeds. And this sort of idea captured her imagination. And so while she was growing up, this was happening, and she had many family friends who were architects. And eventually she decided that that was what she wanted to do. She wanted to become an architect and play a role in building, buildings, basically. Her family moved to London later in her life. And so she ended up attending architecture school in London and was hired by a firm shortly thereafter. She didn't get any commissions initially. It took a little while before somebody finally chose one of her projects, but a German company did invest in one of her early projects and built an amazing building. And it was a firehouse. And one of the distinguishing characteristics of the firehouse was that it had a sloped roof like the wings of a bird.
Oh, wow.
And this is where you start to see some of the distinguishing characteristics of her work. She was known in architecture school and in her firm for using very unusual ways of creating her buildings. She kind of had a painterly way about designing her buildings. And she was really interested in the relationship between nature and humans. And so she integrated a lot of natural elements into her designs. And I'll see if I can find one here for you while I'm talking. Eventually, she received an enormous commission from Cincinnati, the city of Cincinnati, to design a museum. And she was the first woman to ever design a major museum in the United States. And shortly thereafter, she was awarded the prestigious Pritzker Prize for Architecture.
Wow.
She was the youngest person to ever receive that prize. So really her career took off after that, and she designed buildings worldwide, um, all very unique buildings in relationship with the, I don't know if you can see that very well, in relationship with the nature around them or integrating some element of nature. Um, and she's just an amazing architect. She died recently in the 2000s, but you know, her legacy still exists in the buildings that she created. There you
Oh,
can
that's
really see the
gorgeous
nature
and so
outside.
avant-garde. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
really, really, really interesting buildings. So that's Zaha Hadid.
I can imagine she had a lot of turning points in her life where she had her confidence tested. Could you speak to some of those times when, or does the book discuss some of those times when she had to travel forth into her own space? And
Yeah, yeah. I think she did. She did come to a point in her career where she wondered whether or not she was doing the right thing. Um, but you know, I think something inside of her pushed her forward, and she got a break, and that was enough for her to really live into herself. She was a bright character, a bright woman, and she didn't dress in traditional suits. She always wore colorful clothing, and just you know lived herself, lived her own kind of way. You know,
she sounds like a true icon.
yeah, yeah.
And
Would have been she would have been a wonderful person to know.
yes. And I think you've got an icon coming up as
Yes.
your next person.
Yes, this is my my last selection for today, and so this book is called "With Her Fist Raised: The Transformative Power of Black Community Activism" by Laura L. Lovett, and this book is about Dorothy Pittman Hughes. Dorothy, in this picture, you can see it's Dorothy Pittman and Gloria Steinem. But Dorothy's story really begins before she knows Gloria. She was raised in Georgia and in the 50s and eventually moved to New York City. And she became really involved in the civil rights movement. She recognized early on the need to revitalize her West Side neighborhood in New York, which was really subjected to racial discrimination and no child care, substandard housing, a lack of job training, and all sorts of other injustices. So she created a high quality child care center in her neighborhood, and it also offered job training resources, adult education classes, housing assistance, food resources, and a whole lot of other things. So she thought very broadly about what her child care center would provide, with an understanding that by empowering, you know, the people in her own community, they would create and could fight back against the injustices they were experiencing. So she discovered really through her own experience that by engaging and including the community in her neighborhood could be revitalized. Eventually she got involved in the women's liberation movement, and she spent 5 years on the road with Gloria Steinem, educating people about feminism and childcare and racial injustice. At that time, you know, later on, after she was really heavily involved in the women's liberation movement, she got more involved in her neighborhood. And at the time, in order to get the word out, activists had to make copies of their posters and their brochures at a copy shop, like at a print shop. Like today, we can just print them out on our printers or, you know, our computers. But at the time, you actually had to create them, type them up, maybe collage them, and then bring them to a print shop. And she realized that there were no print shops in her neighborhood. You had to leave the neighborhood in order to do that. And it was really central to community activism. So she decided, well, I'm going to do something about that. And she opened a print shop that was combined with an office supply store and also included a bookstore with African American literature. It also had educational programming. It's similar to her daycare center. And she had that shop for a very long time. It was really pivotal in the community and the community activism at the time. Dorothy Pittman Hughes is still alive today. She resides in Florida and she's still active, contributing to lots of efforts in her area.
That's amazing. I read that photo on the cover of the book is in the National Portrait Gallery with other famous people in the Smithsonian, and I just regard her as a face of feminism.
Yes, absolutely. And the feminist movement at the time was not always, it didn't recognize the experience of Black women very well. And so, she and Gloria really spent time talking about that, at least personally. I think they addressed it, even if they didn't always address it on the national stage well. But it's a very powerful photograph, and she has had such an enormous impact, both in New York City and in Florida, where she lives now.
Well, thank you so much for introducing her and introducing all of these trailblazing women. It's been an amazing conversation, Joyce, for sharing your expertise and your curated book selection today. Women's Resource Center is also excited to work with Radnor Library as a community partner. To our viewers, thank you for watching Women Speak. I look forward to bringing you more in-depth conversation in future episodes. For more information about Radnor Library, please visit www.radnorlibrary.org. And for more information about Women's Resource Center, please visit our website, womensresourcecenter.net.